You know what finally made me question everything I thought I knew about lumber? I was standing in a museum in Oslo, looking at the hull of a Viking ship that was pulled out of a burial mound, the Gokstad ship, built around 870 AD, and the planks on that hull were still sound. Not just holding together, sound. Tight grain, no rot worth mentioning, and flexible enough that when they reconstructed a replica, the whole hull flexed in open water the same way it did over 1,000 years ago. Meanwhile, I've got fence boards in my backyard that started cupping after 2 seasons. 2 seasons versus 1,000 years. That contrast hit me hard, and I started digging into exactly how those Norse shipwrights made their planks. What I found changed how I think about every board I pick up. Today, I'm going to walk you through what they did, why it works, and why in some ways that matter enormously, their method still beats what a modern sawmill produces. And stick around to the end, because I'll show you a simple test you can do on any board in your shop to check whether the grain is working for you or against you. Let's get into it. What we're really talking about here is a head-to-head comparison between 2 ways of turning a log into a flat board. One method is 1,000 years old. The other one runs every lumberyard on the planet. And the old way wins on the metrics that matter most: strength, flexibility, and resistance to water. Once you understand why, you'll never look at a stack of lumber the same way again. So, let me give you some context on who these people were and why their approach deserves serious respect. The Norse shipwrights, who built longships during the Viking Age, roughly the 8th through the 11th centuries, were not hobbyists. They were engineers, solving a life-or-death problem. They needed to cross the North Atlantic in open boats, not sheltered coastal waters, the open ocean, with 30-foot swells and freezing spray. And they were building those boats almost entirely from one species, European oak, Quercus robur. They had very limited iron. Nails were precious. Bolts and brackets were rare, so the wood itself had to do most of the structural work. That meant every single plank in the hull had to be as strong as possible per inch of thickness, because weight was the enemy. A heavier hull sits lower, takes on more water, and handles worse in rough seas. So they couldn't just use thick, heavy planks for strength. They needed thin planks that were still incredibly tough. And here's the thing that took me a while to appreciate. They didn't arrive at their method through theory. They arrived at it through generations of trial and error in the most unforgiving testing environment on Earth. If your plank-making technique had a flaw, the ocean showed you, usually by killing you. So, when I tell you these shipwrights developed a specific way of producing planks, understand that every detail of that process was validated by survival. The ships that exist in museums today, the Gokstad, the Oseberg, they represent the winning approach. The methods that didn't work are at the bottom of the North Sea. There's a concept embedded in Scandinavian timberwork that doesn't have a clean English translation, but it essentially means working with the will of the wood. Not imposing your design on the material, but understanding what the tree wants to do and building your design around that. I thought that sounded like philosophy the first time I heard it. Turns out it's the most practical engineering principle I've ever encountered. The first method starts before any tool touches the wood, and it's about how they selected and read the log. A Viking shipwright didn't walk into a lumber yard and pick from a stack. He went into the forest and chose a specific tree. He was looking for old-growth oak, typically 80 to 100 years old minimum, with a straight trunk, minimal branching in the lower section, and consistent growth rings. That last part is critical. Consistent ring spacing means the grain runs straight and parallel through the length of the trunk, and they could read this from the outside. Bark patterns, branch placement, even the way the crown grew told them what was happening inside. They would select a tree, fell it in a specific direction to avoid twisting the trunk on impact, and often they felled in late winter when the sap was down and the moisture content was lower. Compare that to how most of us buy wood today. We walk into a yard, we look at the face of a board, maybe we check for obvious defects, and we take it home. We almost never think about how that board was oriented inside the original log. We never ask whether the grain runs continuously from end to end, or whether the sawmill blade cut across the grain at some angle that introduced weakness. The Viking shipwright would have considered that the most important question of the entire build, and he would have answered it before the tree hit the ground. That level of intention right at the start is something most of us skip entirely, and it has consequences that show up months or years later in our finished work. Now here's where it gets fascinating. Once they had the right log, they didn't saw it, they split it. This process is called riving, and it is the heart of everything that makes these planks superior. Here's how it worked. They would take a straight-grained oak log, typically 8 to 12 feet long, and stand it on end. Using hardwood wedges and heavy wooden mallets, they would drive a wedge into the center of the end grain, splitting the log in half right down the middle. Then they'd take each half and split it again, and again, each time following the natural grain of the wood. For a large log, they might get 16 or even 20 radial planks out of a single trunk, each one tapering like a slice of pie when viewed from the end. Then they'd use a tool that looks like a large, heavy blade with a handle perpendicular to the edge, called a froe, to refine the split and control the thickness. After that, they'd use an axe and eventually a hand plane to smooth the faces. The critical thing to understand is that at no point did a blade ever cut across the grain fibers. Every single fiber in a riven plank runs continuously from one end of the board to the other. Nothing is severed, nothing is interrupted. The plank is essentially a bundle of intact wood fibers held together by natural lignin, running perfectly parallel for the entire length. Now contrast that with what a sawmill does. A circular saw or a bandsaw blade moves through the log in a straight mechanical line. But grain doesn't run in a perfectly straight line. It wanders. It curves around knots. It follows the tree's natural lean. It shifts with growth patterns. So when the saw cuts straight through wandering grain, it severs fibers. This is called grain runout, and it creates weak points throughout the board. Every place where the saw cut across the grain, instead of along it, is a place where the board is weaker, more prone to splitting, and more vulnerable to moisture. A riven plank has zero runout. Zero. Every fiber is intact from end to end. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these shipwright methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called Secrets of the Shipyard, and it covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that most woodworkers have never seen. 150 pages of real hands-on knowledge. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. Alright, let us keep going. This is where the head-to-head comparison gets really tangible. If you take a riven oak plank and a sawn oak plank of identical dimensions, say 1 inch thick by 6 inches wide by 3 feet long, and you clamp one end of each in a vise and push down on the free end, the difference will shock you. The riven plank flexes. It bends in a smooth, even arc and springs back when you release it. The sawn plank, if it has any significant runout, and most sawn planks do, will resist bending and then snap. It breaks at the point where the grain was cut across. This is exactly why Viking shipwrights could build hull strakes as thin as 1 inch and send them across the North Atlantic. A 1 inch thick riven plank has the flex and resilience to absorb wave energy. It bends with the sea and comes back. A 1 inch thick sawn plank would be brittle and rigid in comparison. It would crack under the same stress. The continuous grain acts like a bundle of natural springs. Every fiber works together because every fiber is intact. This is not a marginal difference. In destructive testing done during modern ship reconstructions, riven planks have shown measurably higher tensile strength and dramatically better flexibility than sawn planks from the same species and dimensions. We're talking about a material advantage that comes entirely from how the plank was produced, not from the species or the thickness. Now that you understand the strength advantage, the water story is equally remarkable. When a sawmill blade cuts through a piece of oak, it slices open the wood cells along the surface. Think of it like cutting through a bundle of drinking straws at an angle. You've opened up all those little tubes, and now they can wick moisture right into the interior of the board. That's why sawn lumber soaks up water, especially on end grain and on faces where the runout exposes open cell structures. A riven plank is different. Because the wood was split along the grain, the cell walls on the surface are largely intact. They weren't cut open. They were separated along their natural boundaries. So the surface of a riven plank is essentially a closed wall of intact wood cells. Water hits it and beads off. It doesn't wick in. This is why Viking hulls needed minimal caulking compared to later sawn plank vessels. The wood itself was doing most of the waterproofing work. If you take a riven sample and a sawn sample, both unfinished, and drip water on each surface, you can see this with your own eyes. The sawn surface darkens as the water soaks in. The riven surface holds the droplet on top. That single difference, multiplied across every plank in a hull, is the difference between a ship that stays dry and one that leaks. So, if riving produces a stronger, more flexible, more water-resistant plank, why did we stop doing it? The answer is honest and practical. Sawmills won on speed, volume, and versatility. A sawmill can process any log, regardless of grain direction. It can cut to standardized dimensions. It can produce lumber from plantation-grown timber that doesn't have the straight, consistent grain that riving requires. And it can do all of this hundreds of times faster than a man with wedges and a froe. Riving demands old-growth, straight-grained timber, which is increasingly rare. It demands skill and patience, and it produces planks that taper and vary in width, which don't fit neatly into modern standardized construction. So the sawmill didn't win because it made better boards. It won because it made more boards, faster, from any available timber. And that's a legitimate advantage. I'm not here to tell you to throw away your table saw, but I do think it's worth sitting with the irony for a moment. The method we call primitive produces a plank that is measurably superior in strength, flexibility, and moisture resistance. The method we call advanced introduces structural weaknesses that the primitive method avoids entirely. The Gokstad ship's planks have lasted over 1,000 years. Most modern deck boards won't last 20. Let me share some patterns I've noticed in my own work that this Viking approach handles completely differently. And I did every one of these for longer than I'd like to admit. The first pattern is buying lumber by appearance alone. Most of us stand at the rack, sight down the edge for bow or twist, check the face for knots, and make our decision. What we almost never do is look at the end grain to see how the board was oriented inside the log and whether the grain runs out at an angle. The Norse shipwright would have considered end grain orientation the single most important thing about the plank. It told him everything about how that board would perform for the rest of its life. The second pattern is trusting the sawmill's cut direction without question. We assume that because the board has two flat, parallel faces, the grain must be running neatly between them. It often isn't. The sawmill cut a straight line through a log that wasn't straight, and now there's a runout hiding inside that board. We can't see it on the face, but it's there, and it will show up the first time the joint takes stress, or the board takes on moisture. The third pattern is relying on thickness for strength. When we need a stronger shelf or a tougher panel, our instinct is to use thicker stock. But the Viking shipwrights proved that a thin plank with continuous grain is stronger than a thick plank with severed grain. Thickness is not the only variable. Grain integrity matters more, and in many cases it matters a lot more. The fourth pattern is treating wood finishing as the primary moisture defense. We spend a lot of time and money on sealers, varnishes, and oils to keep water out of our projects, and those finishes matter. But the Norse shipwrights started their moisture defense at the moment they split the plank. The intact cell structure of a riven surface resists water before any finish is ever applied. We're trying to solve with a coating what they solved with the cut itself. The good news is that once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start making better decisions immediately, even if you never rive a single plank yourself. Just reading end grain at the lumberyard and choosing boards with straight, consistent grain will improve your work more than any new tool purchase. Now for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is something I picked up from a shipwright working on a Viking ship reconstruction in Roskilde, Denmark, and I've never seen it in any mainstream woodworking book. He called it a test reeve, and it's dead simple. Before he committed a piece of oak to a hull plank, he would take a short offcut from the same section of the log, about 8 inches long, and split it with a chisel and mallet right down the middle. He wasn't trying to produce a usable piece. He was reading the split. If the split ran straight and true from one end to the other, the grain in that section was good, and he'd proceed with confidence. If the split wandered off to one side, or if it dove down toward one face, he knew there was grain deviation in that section, and he'd either reposition his layout or reject that part of the log entirely. I started doing a version of this in my own shop. Whenever I'm about to use a board for anything structural, a chair leg, a table apron, a shelf that needs to hold real weight, I'll take a short cut off from the same board, stand it up, and tap a wide chisel into the end grain. If it splits clean and straight, I know the grain is running true through that board. If it wanders, I know there's runout, and I either reposition the part on the board or choose a different board. It takes about 30 seconds. It costs you an inch of material, and it tells you more about that board's structural integrity than any visual inspection ever will. I've been doing this for about 3 years now, and I can honestly say it's saved me from at least a dozen failures. Joints that would have been weak, panels that would have cracked, legs that would have broken under load. The old shipwrights tested every plank this way because their lives depended on it. Our projects may not be crossing the North Atlantic, but the principle is exactly the same. Know your grain before you commit your joinery. Now, if this kind of traditional shipwright knowledge is something you want to keep learning from, I have written a guide called Secrets of the Shipyard. It covers 16 chapters of Viking and naval carpentry techniques that have been perfected over centuries. The kind of stuff you will not find in most modern woodworking books. Scan the QR code right now or check the first link below. All right, let us continue. 1,000 years ago, a shipwright standing over an oak log with a wedge and a mallet understood something about wood that most of us have forgotten. The grain is the engineering. Everything else, the tools, the joinery, the finish, it all comes second to whether those fibers are intact and running true. That's what I took away from studying these methods, and it's changed how I work in my own shop every single day. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you on the next one.